She was 28 and homeless, cast out by the town that had been her only anchor in the vast Dakota prairie. They blamed her for a fire she did not set, leaving her with nothing but her father's tools, $17, and a quiet, burning sense of injustice. With nowhere else to go, she walked toward the skeletal ruins of old Fort Holloway, a place everyone else had forgotten. But what nobody knew, least of all Edith Whitcomb, was that buried beneath the floor of its collapsed storehouse was a secret that would not only prove her innocence, but rewrite the history of the town that had abandoned her. Settle in with us for this story, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Edith had come to the Dakota Territory as a girl of 12, trailing behind her father, Thomas Whitcomb. Her mother had not survived the journey, her life given over to a fever somewhere in Nebraska, leaving just the two of them to face the unending grass and sky. Thomas was a carpenter, a man who spoke more fluently with a saw and plane than with his own voice. He was quiet, methodical, and possessed a deep and abiding reverence for the integrity of wood, for the truth of a straight line. In the raw, ambitious town of Prairie's End, he found his purpose. He built the town's first church, its steeple a clean, sharp needle against the blue. He framed the bank, the hotel, and the homes of the men who were growing rich from the railroad and the land. He taught his daughter everything he knew. Edith learned to read the grain of a plank, to know by the scent of sawdust whether it was pine or oak. She learned to square a joint, to drive a nail in 3 clean strokes, to handle a crosscut saw with a steady, rhythmic pull that did not bind the blade. Her father's workshop was her school and her sanctuary. More than any tool, he had taught her to trust the plumb bob. It was a simple thing, a solid brass weight, heavy and cool in the hand, suspended from a braided linen line. He kept it in a small, oiled leather pouch, and he showed her how to let it hang, to wait for its perfect stillness, to find the true vertical that was the foundation of any honest structure. "The world can be crooked, Edie," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "The ground shifts, men lie. But gravity is honest. This line is true." 2 winters ago, pneumonia had taken him, swift and unforgiving. Before he died, his breathing already a shallow rasp, he pressed the leather pouch into her hand. It was the only inheritance that mattered. After his death, Edith tried to carry on his work. She was skilled, her hands as capable as his had been, but Prairie's End was a town of rigid expectations. Men would hire her to mend a fence or rehang a gate, small repairs they deemed suitable for a woman's touch. But for the real work, the framing of a new barn or the construction of a house, they turned to less skilled men from out of town. She lived in the small, perfect house her father had built for them at the edge of town, a testament to his craft in every tight seam and level floorboard. She was an anomaly, a single woman, self-reliant, who did a man's work. The town's founding families, the Baxters and the Caulfields, who controlled the bank, the store, and the council, treated her with a kind of polite dismissal. She was a useful curiosity, but not one of them. The quiet loneliness that had settled over her after her father's death deepened, hardening into a shell of competence and reserve. She learned to expect nothing from anyone, to rely only on the strength in her own arms and the truth of her father's tools. The end of her life in Prairie's End came not with a bang, but with the dry, administrative scratch of a pen on paper. A fire had started in the back of the general store owned by Silas Baxter. It was late afternoon, and the flames, fed by lamp oil and dry goods, had moved with a hungry speed, consuming the store and gutting the adjacent land office, which belonged to Jedediah Caulfield. Edith had been in the store earlier that day. Baxter had hired her for a small job, reinforcing a section of shelving in the very storeroom where the fire began. It was a faulty lamp. Everyone knew it, one that had been flickering and leaking for weeks. But Baxter, a man whose piety was as thin as his hairline, saw an opportunity. An act of God was one thing, negligence was another, a way to direct blame and ensure a favorable insurance settlement without question. He needed a scapegoat, and the solitary woman carpenter was a convenient one. She was an outsider, with no family to defend her, no husband to speak for her name. The town council met the next morning. It was not a trial. It was a verdict delivered before any testimony was heard. Baxter and Caulfield, their faces masks of solemn civic duty, laid out the case. They did not accuse her of arson. That would be too bold, too easy to dispute. They spoke of negligence, of carelessness. A tool left behind, a jostled lamp. It was all insinuation, but it was enough. They presented her with a document, a formal declaration of liability. The cost of the damages was an astronomical sum, a figure designed to be impossible. It was a debt she could never hope to pay. The choice was simple and brutal: settle the debt or forfeit her property and leave the town's jurisdiction forever. The property was her father's house. The debt was a cage. The town marshal, a stout man named Cobb, whose loyalty to Baxter was a matter of public record, delivered the paper to her at her front door. He did not meet her eyes. She read the neatly written lines, saw the signatures of the councilmen at the bottom. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead or argue. In the cold, clear cruelty of the document, she recognized the same dishonest logic her father had warned her about, the crookedness of a world built on self-interest. To fight would be to wrestle with shadows. They had already decided her fate. She turned and went back inside her home. Marshal Cobb waited on the porch, a silent, stolid guard. Edith moved through the two small rooms, her movements deliberate and calm. She did not pack the life she had lived there. She packed the tools to build a new one. Into a heavy canvas sack went her father's hand saw, his hammer, the pry bar, his set of chisels wrapped in an oilcloth roll. She tucked the small leather pouch with the plumb bob into an inner pocket. She added a change of clothes, a small tin of hard biscuits, and the worn billfold that held her entire savings, $17. She left the sturdy furniture her father had built, the braided rug on the floor, the scent of wood shavings and turpentine that still clung to the walls. Her final glance was for the house itself, for the perfectly joined corners of the window frames, the level line of the mantelpiece. It was a structure built on truth. She was being exiled by a town built on lies. She closed the door softly, walked onto the porch, and handed the key to the marshal. He took it without a word. Edith shouldered her sack, walked down the steps, and left Prairie's End without looking back. She walked west, following the faint ruts of the old cavalry trail that cut a path across the prairie. The sun was a low, burning ember on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out before her like accusations. The air was turning sharp and cold, carrying the first premonition of winter. Her world shrank to the rhythm of her own body in motion, the steady crunch of her boots on the dry earth, the strain in her shoulders from the weight of the canvas sack, the cool air filling her lungs. The prairie surrounded her, a vast, rustling sea of grass under a sky of deepening indigo. The wind was a constant, mournful sigh, a sound so immense it seemed like the earth's own breathing. She walked until the lights of Prairie's End were long gone, until the moon, a sliver of bone, rose high in the blackness. Her legs ached with a deep, satisfying burn. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the hollow space that had opened inside her. She had no plan, no destination beyond putting one foot in front of the other. But in the back of her mind was a place she knew of, a ghost on the landscape. Fort Holloway. It was an old army post, built on a bluff overlooking a shallow creek, about a day's hard walk from town. It had been abandoned a decade ago, after the war, its garrison withdrawn, its buildings left to the wind and the snow. People said it was haunted, a place of bad memories. No one ever went there. For Edith, that was its primary recommendation. It was a place to be alone. It was a place to stop moving. She did not allow herself the release of tears. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she focused on the details of the land with the precise, observing eye her father had taught her. She noted the gentle slope of the ground, the outcroppings of granite that broke through the soil, the way the tallest grasses bent, indicating the prevailing direction of the wind. She was assessing her environment, judging its character, just as she would a piece of timber. Sometime after midnight, she stopped. She sat with her back against a low, stony ridge, took a careful sip from her canteen, and ate one of the dry biscuits from her tin. She chewed slowly, making it last. It was sustenance, not comfort. Then she got to her feet and walked on. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to separate the earth from the sky, she saw it. A collection of dark, angular shapes on a rise in the distance, stark against the brightening horizon, the silhouette of a broken stockade fence, the gaunt, skeletal frames of buildings where roofs had collapsed. Fort Holloway. It looked like a graveyard of ambition, desolate and unwelcoming. But to Edith, after a night of walking into emptiness, it was something solid. It was a landmark. It was a form of shelter. She shifted the weight of the sack on her shoulder and quickened her pace, her boots whispering through the dew-wet grass as she walked toward the ruins. Climbing the bluff, she felt the full force of the wind, a raw, unimpeded current of air that whipped her hair across her face and chilled her to the bone. The fort was even more derelict up close than it had appeared from a distance. The great timbered gate had torn loose from its massive iron hinges and lay half buried in the earth. The parade ground, once a flat, packed expanse of dirt, was now a thicket of thistle and prairie weeds, their burrs clinging to her skirt. She moved methodically through the compound, inspecting the decay. The long barracks buildings were open to the sky, their roofs gone, their interiors filled with drifted soil and animal nests. The commander's house, a 2-story structure of sawed lumber, was a hollowed-out shell, its windows like vacant eyes. Her search led her finally to the quartermaster's storehouse. It was a long, low building, more fortress than house, constructed of thick limestone blocks and heavy timbers. It was built into the side of the hill, using the earth itself as one of its foundations. One end of the roof had caved in completely, leaving a tangled wreck of splintered beams and rotting shingles. But the other end, the one pressed against the hillside, seemed largely intact. She pushed open the heavy, groaning door and stepped inside. The air was cold and still, thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the faint, dusty scent of forgotten things. It was dark, the only light coming from the gaping hole in the roof at the far end and a few narrow slits in the stone walls that had once served as windows. The storehouse was cavernous, perhaps 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. The immense ponderosa pine beams that supported the remaining roof were as thick as a man's chest. Some were still solid, dark with age. Others were soft with rot, trailing long beards of moss. The floor was mostly packed earth, but she could see the remnants of wooden planking in the more protected section near the back wall. It was this corner that drew her. It was the driest, most sheltered part of the building. With a broken plank she found on the ground, she began to sweep, clearing a space of rubble, dirt, and the debris of decades. She used the small saw from her sack to cut away a dangerously dangling beam, the sound of the teeth biting into the old wood, a small, reassuring act of order in the midst of chaos. Here, she had 4 solid walls and a partial roof. It was not a home, but it was a reprieve from the wind. But as a cold front rolled in that afternoon, bringing with it a fine, persistent rain, she discovered the flaw in her refuge. The packed earth floor began to weep moisture. A deep, seeping dampness rose from the ground, making the air feel even colder, turning her single blanket clammy. She needed to get off the ground. She needed a dry space, not just for sleeping, but for the simple act of existing without being saturated by the chill. Her eyes fell again on a section of the floor near the back wall. It was a raised platform of wooden planks, about 6 feet square, sitting a few inches higher than the surrounding earth. It looked like it might have been a loading area, or perhaps it covered something. The planks were thick oak, weathered to a silver gray but remarkably solid, protected as they were from the worst of the elements. An idea, born of desperate necessity, began to form in her mind. She reached into her sack and took out her father's pry bar. She knelt beside the raised platform, the cold of the damp earth seeping through the knees of her trousers. The oak planks were fitted tightly together, their surfaces worn smooth by time and use. She wedged the tip of the pry bar into the thin seam between two of the boards and pushed. Nothing, the old square-headed nails, forged by some long-forgotten blacksmith, held fast in the timber below. She repositioned the bar, finding a better purchase, and put her full weight into it, her muscles straining. With a sudden, violent screech of tortured metal, one end of the plank lifted a few inches. A puff of dry, ancient dust billowed out, smelling of earth and absolute stillness. Encouraged, she worked the bar along the length of the board, and with another groan of protest, it came free. She laid it aside and peered into the darkness below. It was not solid earth, it was a hollow space, a small, stone-lined cellar dug into the ground beneath the floor. It appeared to be a root cellar, a cold storage pit common in such outposts, perfectly preserved in the dry earth beneath the storehouse. It was about 6 feet square and maybe 4 feet deep, and it was, miraculously, bone dry. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw them. Sitting squarely in the middle of the cellar's earthen floor were 3 wooden chests. They were standard-issue Army footlockers, built of pine and bound with straps of black iron. Stenciled in fading black paint on the side of each were the words U.S. Army Property and Fort Holloway. But beneath that, in a different, fainter script, was another stencil, the name A. Shaw. Her heart beat a little faster. This was not a forgotten supply cache. This was deliberately hidden. The locks on the chests were heavy iron hasps, sealed by rust. She used the pry bar again, jamming it under the lid of the first chest and heaving upwards. The rusted hasp snapped with a sharp crack. She lifted the heavy lid. The first chest was filled with provisions. Neatly packed tins of coffee, their paper labels still bright. Heavy canvas bags of sugar. Bolts of dark blue wool cloth, the kind used for army uniforms. And at the bottom, a dozen pairs of new cavalry boots, the leather still stiff and smelling faintly of tannin. These were not spoiled or leftover goods. They were prime supplies, valuable and easily traded. The second chest was heavier. When she forced it open, she found it filled not with goods, but with paper. On top were several official-looking, leather-bound ledgers. She opened the first. It was a quartermaster's logbook, filled with neat columns of figures detailing the fort's inventory. But tucked inside its pages was a smaller personal account book. Edith pulled it out and opened it. The handwriting was the same, but the contents were starkly different. This was a secret record. It detailed transactions, not of issue, but of sale. Crate after crate of army supplies, flour, bacon, ammunition, blankets, sold for cash to local traders and merchants. The ledger named names, and there, repeated again and again, were 2 she knew, Baxter and Caulfield. They had been young men then, just starting out, their businesses built on contracts to supply the fort. The ledger was a meticulous record of their collusion with the fort's quartermaster, a scheme to defraud the U.S. Army by selling off its own supplies and then covering their tracks. A final entry described the deliberate burning of the fort's official supply records just before its decommissioning, a fire blamed on a lightning strike. The third chest was different. It held personal effects, a neatly folded cavalry sergeant's jacket, the wool still in good condition, a small, framed tintype photograph of a serious-looking woman and a small boy with wide, curious eyes, and an oilskin pouch, sealed with wax. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was written in the same careful hand as the ledgers. It was addressed simply, to whoever finds this. It was a confession and a testament, written by a man named Alistair Shaw, quartermaster sergeant. He explained the scheme, his own complicity born of threats against his family. He wrote of how Baxter and Caulfield, his partners in the crime, had cheated him of his share and left him to take the fall. Before he could expose them, he received sudden orders for a transfer. He had hidden this small portion of the goods he'd managed to secure, along with the ledger that proved the entire conspiracy, intending to return for it. But he feared he never would. "I have lost my honor," he wrote, "but I pray this record may one day restore the truth. I leave this in the hope that my son, Andrew, might grow up in a world where such crimes do not go unpunished, and that he becomes a better man than his father was." He signed it, S.G.T. Alistair Shaw, a man who made a poor bargain. Edith sat back on her heels in the dusty silence of the cellar, the letter in her hand. She looked from the tintype of the small boy to the names in the ledger. This was no longer just about a fire in a general store. It was about a truth that had been buried for a decade, a crime that had been the very foundation of the town that had cast her out. The discovery settled a new kind of purpose in her bones. Survival was no longer enough. Now there was a reason for it. She climbed out of the cellar, leaving the chests for the moment, and set about her own smaller acts of restoration. She took one of the heavy wool army blankets from the first crate and laid it over her pallet of pine boughs, creating a barrier against the damp chill. In a cleared corner of the storehouse, she built a small, careful fire in a ring of stones, using dry, splintered timber from the collapsed section of the building. She filled her small pot with water from the creek and brewed coffee from one of Sergeant Shaw's tins. The rich, dark aroma filled the cold space, the first scent of comfort and civilization she had known in days. It was as she was sipping the hot, bitter liquid that a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. A man on horseback had ridden up the bluff, drawn by the faint, unfamiliar wisp of smoke. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by the sun and wind, marked by a long, pale scar that ran from his temple down his jawline. He dismounted slowly. "This is private land," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Or what's left of it." Edith stood, her hand resting near the pry bar she had leaned against the wall. "I meant no harm," she said. "I needed shelter." The man's eyes took in her small, orderly camp, the neat pile of firewood, the mended corner of the roof. He was not threatening, merely watchful. "My name is Andrew Shaw," he said. "My ranch borders this property." The name struck her like a physical blow. Shaw. She looked from his scarred face to the loose floorboards covering the cellar. This was the boy from the tintype, grown into a man who wore his history on his face. "Shaw," she repeated, her voice quiet, like the name on the crates. Andrew's expression, already grim, hardened further. He knew the stories. He had grown up in the shadow of a father, branded a thief and a deserter, a man who had vanished from Fort Holloway, leaving a stain on his family's name. In that moment, Edith made a choice. She trusted the truth. She gestured toward the cellar. "You should see what your father left," she said. Warily, he followed her. She lifted the plank and held her lantern over the opening. He peered down, his gaze falling on the stenciled name on the footlockers. He lowered himself into the pit, and Edith passed him the ledgers and the oilskin pouch. He sat on an overturned crate and began to read. He read the damning entries in the secret account book. He read his father's letter, his face unreadable in the flickering lantern light. He picked up the tintype, his thumb brushing over the image of the small boy he once was. When he finally looked up, his eyes were dark with a decade of buried anger and shame. "So this is it," he said, his voice rough. "They built their fortunes on my father's ruin." He had been a cavalry scout himself before he'd started his ranch, and he understood the logistics of supply lines, the myriad ways a clever, dishonest man could bleed the army dry. He looked at Edith, a long, assessing gaze. "What do you want?" he asked. "Justice," she said simply. "They ran me out of town on a lie. It seems to be a habit of theirs." An unspoken pact was forged in that dusty cellar. It was not friendship, not yet. It was an alliance of two solitary people bound by a shared enemy and a shared need for the truth to be brought into the light. Andrew Shaw was a man of action, not words. "You have coffee," he stated, looking at the open crate. "I have lumber." It was a trade, not charity. The next morning, he returned not on horseback, but in a sturdy wagon drawn by two stout mules. The wagon bed was loaded with fresh milled pine boards, a small keg of nails, and a roll of tar paper. He also brought a sack of potatoes and a thick slab of bacon, which he set down without comment. And then, they began to work. They were a study in quiet competence. Edith, with her father's tools and her innate understanding of structure, and Andrew, with his raw strength and the practical, problem-solving mind of a rancher. The silence between them was not awkward, but companionable, filled with the sounds of labor, the clean bite of Edith's saw, the rhythmic percussion of her hammer, the grunt of effort as Andrew hoisted a new beam into place. They started with the roof over her corner of the storehouse, first reinforcing the main support beam, then patching the gaping hole with the new planks. Edith, perched precariously on the rafters, nailed the boards down while Andrew sealed the seams with hot tar. The work was hard, but it was honest. A few days into their labor, another visitor arrived. An elderly Lakota woman named Mary Little Crow, whose small camp was situated down by the creek, walked up the bluff, her expression curious. She watched Edith work for a long time, her dark eyes missing nothing. She had known Thomas Whitcomb, had traded with him years ago, and respected him as a man whose work was true. She saw the same integrity in his daughter. She said nothing, but the following day she returned. She carried a bundle, which she laid at the entrance to the storehouse. Inside was a collection of dried herbs for making tea, and a magnificent, heavy buffalo robe, tanned to a soft, supple leather on one side, and thick with dark fur on the other. She had seen that Edith had only thin army blankets against the deepening autumn cold. The robe was a gift, a gesture of respect and acceptance. The small, isolated community of the fort had begun to form, one quiet act of practical generosity at a time. The corner of the quartermaster's storehouse was no longer a desperate refuge. It was a room. Under their combined labor, it had transformed. The roof was now whole and watertight. Edith had used the old salvaged oak planks to lay a solid, level floor, banishing the dampness for good. With the leftover lumber from Andrew's wagon, she had built a small, sturdy table and a single, straight-backed chair. She constructed a proper hearth of flat stones against the back wall, with a cleverly designed flue that drew the smoke up and out through a small gap in the stonework. The magnificent buffalo robe Mary Little Crow had given her was spread over her cot, a luxurious warmth against the cold nights. The space was spare, every object in it earned and purposeful. But it was hers. It was a home she had literally built from the ground up, a place of order carved from ruin. A new rhythm established itself on the bluff. Andrew came by most days after tending to his own ranch chores. Sometimes he brought more materials, and they would continue their slow reclamation of the fort, shoring up a crumbling wall or clearing another section of rubble. Other times, he would bring his own work, a broken axle for his wagon, a saddle with a torn strap, and they would work alongside each other in the shared space, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and oiled leather. Here, Edith's skills were not a novelty or a service to be sold for pennies. They were essential, respected. She was a builder, a partner in labor. The fort itself was slowly becoming the center of a new, informal economy. A French-Canadian trapper named Dubois, hearing of the woman at the old fort from Mary Little Crow, stopped by on his way south for the winter. He traded a string of glossy beaver pelts for a bag of sugar and 2 tins of coffee, carrying the story with him down the trail. Not the story of an outcast, but of a resourceful woman with goods to trade and the skill to make a home from nothing. The evenings were for the ledgers. By the light of a kerosene lamp Andrew had brought, They would sit at the table Edith had built and pore over Sergeant Shaw's secret accounts. They were building their case, piece by piece. Andrew, drawing on his memory as a cavalry scout, began to map out the illicit supply routes described in the book. He knew the old trails, the hidden coulees, the remote trading posts where such transactions could take place unnoticed. He could add his own testimony, corroborating the logistics of the fraud. The names in the ledger, Baxter, Caulfield, were no longer just words on a page. They were destinations, dates, and verifiable facts. Edith was no longer Edith Whitcomb, the disgraced carpenter. She was becoming the keeper of Fort Holloway. Travelers began to refer to the place as Edith's Fort. She had acquired an authority that no town council could grant, an authority earned through competence and possession of the truth. The fort, once a symbol of her exile, had become her fortress, her livelihood, and the repository of her vindication. Finally, they decided the time was right. Andrew would take the ledgers and his maps and ride to the territorial capital at Yankton. He would bypass Prairie's End entirely and present the evidence directly to the United States Marshal. The case was too serious, the fraud too large, for a local magistrate. It was a federal crime. His role was to be the messenger, the witness. Edith's role was to stay, to guard the fort, the physical proof of everything. He took the official logbook and his father's secret ledger. But Edith kept the personal items, the letter, the tintype, and the folded blue jacket. They were the heart of the story. In the week that Andrew was gone, a profound quiet settled over the fort. Edith had finished her work. The room she had carved out of the storehouse was complete. It was clean, warm, and ordered. Her father's tools, cleaned and oiled, hung in a neat row on a rack she had built against the stone wall. The air was still, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the constant sweeping whisper of the wind outside. She stood in the open doorway, her arms crossed against the chill, and looked out over the vast, tawny expanse of the prairie. The world felt immense, and she felt small within it, yet for the first time in her life, she felt securely anchored. She ran a hand over the smooth, plain surface of the table she had made. She thought of Silas Baxter and Jedediah Caulfield, men who had seen her as nothing more than a woman to be used and discarded. They saw her as someone who mended things. Here, in this abandoned place, she had not merely mended. She had built. She had created a life from what they had left for dead. Later, she sat at the table and took out the two small objects she kept on a narrow shelf above her hearth. The first was her father's plumb bob, its heavy brass body gleaming in the firelight, its braided line coiled neatly in its worn leather pouch. The second was the tintype of Sergeant Alistair Shaw's wife and his young son, Andrew. She held them both in her hands, one in each palm. The plumb bob, her father's symbol of integrity, of the unwavering, honest line that must be the foundation of all good work. And the photograph, a father's desperate hope for his son's future, a prayer that he might live in a world where the truth mattered. Thomas Whitcomb had lived his entire life by that straight line. Alistair Shaw had lost his way, had made a poor bargain, but in his final act of burying the evidence, he had been trying to find his way back to it. He had created a cache of truth for someone else to find, a message in a bottle set adrift in the sea of time. And she had been the one to find it. The legacies of two fathers, one her own, beloved and honorable, the other a stranger, flawed and repentant, had converged here, in her hands, in this fortress of stone and timber. A movement on the horizon caught her eye, a single rider moving steadily toward the bluff. Her heart gave a lurch. It was Andrew. As he drew closer, she could read his posture in the saddle. He was not riding with the slump of defeat. His back was straight, his shoulders square. He rode directly to the storehouse and dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him truly smile. It was not the tight, wry quirk of his scarred mouth she had grown used to. It was a broad, open smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "They listened," he said, his voice full of a relief so profound it was almost tangible. The U.S. Marshal in Yankton had taken the ledgers, had listened to his testimony, and had immediately understood the gravity of the fraud. A federal investigation was being launched. Warrants had been issued for the arrest of Silas Baxter and Jedediah Caulfield on charges of conspiracy and fraud against the United States government. Their businesses, their homes, their bank accounts, all built on a foundation of lies, were being seized. The truth, buried for a decade under the prairie sod, was finally being brought into the daylight. His father's name would be cleared. The official record would be amended to show he had died in service, his last acts instrumental in exposing a crime against the nation he served. Edith looked at Andrew, at the unburdening of a lifetime of shame from his face. Then she looked back at the small, sturdy room she now called home. She was 28 and had been driven out, disgraced and penniless. She had taken refuge in a ruin. But in that ruin, she had found her own strength, her own purpose, and a justice far greater than she could have imagined. The town had cast her out, but the prairie had taken her in. Edith Whitcomb was cast out with nothing but her father's tools and $17. She took refuge in a ruin, and there she found a truth that had been buried for a decade. It was the best thing that ever happened to her. The foundation of a new and honest life built with her own two hands. What have you, in your own life, built from something that someone else threw away? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, thank you for being part of our community. Stay close for more stories like this one.